Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a substance that was once sold legally in health food stores next to protein powder and vitamins. The same chemical that became synonymous with sexual assault, the identical compound that chemists designed to help people sleep peacefully. Here's the beautiful irony. Doctors created it as a safer anesthetic. Bodybuilders gulped it down for bigger muscles. Ravers discovered it made dancing feel like flying. And predators learned it could erase someone's memory of an entire night. One bottle. 4 completely different worlds. The substance earned nicknames that tell its whole twisted story. Liquid ecstasy, grievous bodily harm, Georgia homeboy, and eventually the media's favourite, the date rape drug. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support, we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. To understand how one clear liquid became 4 different drugs depending on who held the bottle, you first need to understand what happened in a French laboratory in 1960. Dr. Henri Laborie wasn't trying to create a party drug or a weapon. The anesthesiologist wanted something simple, a substance that could put surgical patients to sleep without killing them, which was apparently a challenge with 1960s anesthetics. Ether made people vomit for hours after waking up. Chloroform damaged livers and occasionally stopped hearts entirely. Barbiturates worked great until they didn't, and then the patient just never woke up. Laborie needed something that mimicked the brain's natural sleep chemistry, rather than bludgeoning consciousness into submission. He synthesized gamma-hydroxybutyrate, GHB for those who don't enjoy saying 6 syllables. The molecule looked remarkably similar to GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which functions as the brain's natural brake pedal. Every time you calm down, relax or drift towards sleep, GABA floods your neural synapses and tells your neurons to shut up and sit down. Laborit's creation slipped across the blood-brain barrier like it owned the place, then activated the same receptors that GABA uses. The brain couldn't tell the difference between its own calming chemical and this synthetic imposter. The effects arrived in waves rather than crashes. Small doses produced relaxation and mild euphoria, the feeling of sinking into a warm bath after a brutal day. Medium doses brought deeper sedation, muscle relaxation, and a pleasant disconnection from anxiety. Large doses simply turned off consciousness like flipping a light switch. No gradual fade, no dreamy transition, just off. European hospitals began using GHB as an anesthetic in the 1960s and 1970s. French and Italian surgeons particularly appreciated how patients woke up without the usual post-anesthesia misery. No nausea, no confusion, no hangover feeling. Patients opened their eyes, asked what happened, and seemed genuinely refreshed rather than beaten down by chemicals. The substance appeared to work with the body's natural systems rather than against them. But GHB had a problem that would define its entire future: unpredictability. The difference between a therapeutic dose and an overdose was smaller than almost any other sedative. One person might need 2 grams to feel relaxed, while another person would collapse unconscious from the same amount. Body weight mattered, stomach contents mattered, individual brain chemistry mattered enormously. 2 people could take identical doses and have completely different experiences, one person chatting happily, while the other person lay unresponsive on the floor. This narrow margin between effect and disaster made GHB impractical as a surgical anesthetic. Anesthesiologists need precision. They need to know exactly how much will sedate versus how much will stop breathing. GHB offered neither certainty nor control. By the late 1970s, most European hospitals had moved on to more predictable options like propofol and midazolam. Medical researchers found a different application. Narcolepsy patients, people whose brains randomly hit the sleep button at inappropriate moments, often suffered from disrupted nighttime sleep. Their nights consisted of brief, shallow sleep cycles that left them exhausted. GHB's ability to induce deep, restorative sleep helped some narcolepsy patients finally rest properly. Italian physicians published studies showing improvements in daytime alertness when patients took GHB before bed. The substance also showed promise treating alcoholism. Recovering alcoholics often struggled with severe sleep disruption during withdrawal, which frequently led to relapse. GHB helped smooth the transition, providing sleep without alcohol and reducing cravings. Small European addiction clinics began experimenting with GHB protocols in the 1980s. These legitimate medical applications remained confined mostly to Europe. American physicians showed little interest in a substance with such unpredictable dosing. The FDA never approved GHB for general medical use, which meant it existed in a legal grey zone in the United States, not approved as medicine, not banned as a drug, just floating in regulatory limbo. This ambiguous legal status created an opening. In the early 1980s, someone noticed something interesting in the medical literature. GHB appeared to stimulate growth hormone release during sleep. Growth hormone builds muscle, burns fat, and aids recovery. Exactly what bodybuilders wanted. The person who first made this connection remains unclear, lost to history like so many underground drug discoveries. But once the information reached the bodybuilding community, everything changed. Health food stores in California began stocking GHB in the mid-1980s under names like Renutrient and Revitrant. The marketing avoided explicit drug claims but heavily implied performance benefits. Labels suggested taking it before bed for enhanced recovery and improved body composition. No prescription required, no age restrictions, just another supplement sitting between the creatine and the amino acids. Bodybuilders discovered that GHB delivered on its promises. Taking 2 or 3 grams before sleep produced the deepest, most restorative rest many had ever experienced. Users reported waking up feeling genuinely refreshed rather than groggy. Recovery between workouts seemed faster. Some claimed visible improvements in muscle definition within weeks. The substance spread through gyms via word of mouth, moving from hardcore bodybuilders to casual fitness enthusiasts to anyone wanting better sleep. The supplement industry loved GHB because it worked obviously and immediately. Most supplements offer subtle benefits that might be placebo. GHB knocked you unconscious within 30 minutes. Customers knew immediately whether they'd gotten the real product. This reliability made it popular despite the complete absence of safety testing, quality control, or dosing guidance. Nobody thought about what could go wrong. Nobody considered that a substance too unpredictable for hospitals might be dangerous in gyms. Nobody wondered whether selling a powerful sedative without medical supervision was wise. The bottles just sat on shelves next to the protein powder, waiting for the inevitable disasters to begin. The disasters arrived faster than anyone anticipated. Bodybuilders began collapsing at competitions in the late 1980s, seizing on stage mid-pose, dropping weights during training sessions. Emergency rooms near major gyms started seeing a pattern. Young, extremely fit men arriving unconscious with no obvious injury or illness. Their vital signs showed profound central nervous system depression. Blood work revealed nothing standard toxicology tests could identify. The patients would simply sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake up confused and embarrassed. Doctors couldn't figure out what these athletes were taking. The victims often couldn't remember either. GHB erased short-term memory formation, so users frequently forgot they'd taken it by the time they regained consciousness. Some emergency physicians assumed a new steroid was causing problems. Others suspected contaminated supplements. Nobody initially connected the incidents to the clear liquid being sold legally in health food stores. The supplement companies marketing GHB never provided dosing instructions beyond vague suggestions. Bottles might say, "take before bed," without specifying how much constituted a dose. Users eyeballed measurements, pouring random amounts into water or juice. Some used teaspoons, others used tablespoons. A few just swigged directly from the bottle. The difference between those measurements meant the difference between sleep and coma. Bodybuilders developed their own underground dosing guidelines through trial and error, which translated to numerous errors before finding what worked. Online bulletin boards and gym conversations spread information like a game of telephone, each person slightly misremembering or exaggerating what they'd heard. One popular recommendation suggested a capful, without specifying which bottle's cap. Bottle caps varied wildly in size. The growth hormone claims that made GHB popular were partially accurate, which made everything worse. The substance did increase growth hormone secretion during deep sleep stages. Studies confirmed elevated levels in users compared to normal sleep. But growth hormone's muscle-building effects were far more modest than the supplement marketing implied. Users attributed any gains to GHB when consistent training and nutrition deserved the credit. Still, the placebo effect combined with genuine sleep improvement created legions of devoted users. Bodybuilders swore by their nightly GHB ritual. Some took it religiously for months or years without incident. Others had terrifying experiences on their first attempt. The unpredictability made every dose a gamble, but gamblers rarely stop when they're winning. By 1989, the FDA had received dozens of reports of severe adverse reactions, seizures, respiratory depression, unconsciousness, and at least one death. The agency began investigating GHB but faced a jurisdictional puzzle. Technically, GHB was being sold as a dietary supplement under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. This classification gave it special regulatory protection that actual drugs didn't enjoy. Supplement companies could market products without proving safety or efficacy, as long as they avoided explicit medical claims. The FDA issued warnings in 1990, urging consumers to avoid GHB products. The warnings described serious risks without actually banning the substance. Health food stores continued selling it. Manufacturers ignored the warnings entirely. Underground demand remained strong enough that stopping seemed pointless to retailers making easy money. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about drugs. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The FDA warnings had an unintended consequence that would shape GHB's future trajectory. When federal authorities tell people a substance is dangerous, it signals to certain populations that the substance must be very powerful. Ravers, club kids, and recreational drug users began paying attention. A legal substance that put bodybuilders into comas sounded far more interesting than safe supplements. Home manufacturing exploded after the FDA warnings made commercial GHB harder to find. The synthesis was absurdly simple. High school chemistry simple. GHB required only two precursor chemicals that were commonly available: gamma-butyrolactone, GBL, and sodium hydroxide, drain cleaner. Mix them together with the right proportions and temperature control, and GHB crystallized out of solution. No complicated glassware, no exotic reagents, no advanced degree necessary. College chemistry students started cooking GHB in dorm rooms and apartments. The process took a few hours and produced enough to supply dozens of people. One successful batch could fund a month of partying or turn a nice profit. The precursor chemicals weren't controlled substances, so ordering them raised no legal red flags. GBL was commonly used as an industrial solvent. Sodium hydroxide was in every hardware store. Quality control disappeared entirely once manufacturing moved underground. Commercial supplements at least attempted some consistency, even if their dosing guidance was terrible. Home cooks produced wildly variable concentrations depending on their technique and measurements. One batch might be weak enough that users needed 5 grams to feel effects. The next batch might be concentrated enough that 1 gram caused unconsciousness. Users had no way to know what they were getting. The underground market developed its own distribution network through gyms, supplement shops, and increasingly, nightclubs. Dealers sold GHB in small bottles, usually 30 to 100 milliliters, for $20 to $50. The economics were attractive. Raw materials cost almost nothing, production was simple, and demand kept growing. Risk was minimal since GHB remained in a legal grey area. Police didn't know what it was. Courts hadn't decided how to classify it. Bodybuilders weren't the only athletes discovering GHB's appeal. Wrestlers, fighters, and football players began using it for recovery. The substance helped them sleep despite injuries and training stress. Some users claimed faster healing times, though no research supported this. The athletic community embraced GHB as a performance tool rather than a recreational drug, maintaining the fiction that they were supplementing rather than drugging. Professional athletes occasionally tested positive for GHB metabolites in sports drug screenings. Testing organizations hadn't anticipated needing to screen for a sleep aid, so most didn't include it in standard panels. When tests did detect it, athletes claimed supplement contamination or prescribed medication. Without clear regulations around GHB, sports authorities struggled to enforce penalties. The medical community remained largely unaware of GHB's growing popularity. Most physicians had never heard of it outside obscure European anesthesia research. Emergency departments saw overdose cases but couldn't identify the substance. Toxicology labs didn't test for GHB unless specifically requested, and even then the metabolites cleared the body within 12 hours. Patients arrived unconscious, slept for a few hours, woke up fine, and left before anyone figured out what happened. This invisibility to medical testing made GHB particularly dangerous. Paramedics and emergency physicians rely on toxicology results to guide treatment. With GHB, they had to guess. Overdose symptoms resembled alcohol intoxication, opioid overdose, or head injury. Treatment protocols differed significantly for each. Guessing wrong could kill the patient. Some emergency departments began recognizing GHB's distinctive pattern. Young, healthy patients with profound unconsciousness, no response to naloxone, the opioid reversal drug, and spontaneous awakening after 3 to 4 hours. The unconsciousness was so deep that patients didn't respond to painful stimuli. Doctors could move their limbs into any position, and they'd stay there, completely flaccid. Then suddenly they'd wake up, confused but otherwise fine, with no memory of the previous hours. The bodybuilding community started experiencing its first addiction cases. Users who took GHB nightly for months found they couldn't sleep without it. Attempts to stop caused severe insomnia, anxiety, tremors, and in extreme cases, seizures. The withdrawal syndrome resembled alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, among the most dangerous withdrawal types. Some users needed medical detoxification to quit safely. Nobody had predicted GHB would be addictive. The early literature suggested low abuse potential because it didn't produce the intense euphoria associated with highly addictive drugs. But psychological dependence developed easily, and physical dependence followed with regular use. Users became trapped in a cycle, taking GHB to sleep, developing tolerance, needing higher doses, experiencing withdrawal without it. The supplement bottles had moved from health food stores to gym bags to nightclub bathrooms. What started as a bodybuilding recovery aid was about to find its true calling in a very different environment, where the consequences would be far more severe than collapsed weightlifters and missed workouts. The transformation was already beginning as the 1990s approached and a new drug culture prepared to embrace liquid euphoria. The rave scene found GHB sometime around 1990, though pinpointing the exact moment is impossible since underground drug cultures don't keep records. What's certain is that someone carried a small bottle into a warehouse party in Los Angeles or San Francisco, shared it with friends, and recognized immediately that this clear liquid fit perfectly with electronic music and all-night dancing. The effects matched the culture better than anything else available. MDMA was the reigning king of rave drugs, but it came with problems. The amphetamine base caused jaw clenching, dehydration, overheating, and a brutal midweek crash. Acid lasted too long and made dancing difficult when the walls started breathing. Cocaine was expensive and made users aggressive rather than connected. Alcohol was just boring compared to what ravers wanted from altered consciousness. GHB offered something different: euphoria without stimulation, relaxation without sedation at the right dose, enhanced music appreciation, and tactile sensitivity that made dancing feel more fluid. Users describe sensations of melting into the music, of their bodies moving without conscious effort. The substance lowered inhibitions without eliminating coordination at moderate doses. People felt more social, more connected, more present in their bodies. The rave community nicknamed it liquid ecstasy, despite having completely different chemistry from MDMA. Marketing mattered more than accuracy. The name suggested similar effects while distinguishing it as its own experience. Other nicknames proliferated: Liquid G, Liquid X, Georgia Homeboy, Grievous Bodily Harm, G, Goop, Scoop. Each city developed its own slang. GHB spread through the underground party circuit faster than any drug before it. The liquid form made it easy to transport and share. One bottle could dose 20 people. Carrying it raised no suspicions since it looked like water or energy drink in an unlabeled container. Drug-sniffing dogs couldn't detect it. Police didn't know what it was even if they found it. Ravers appreciated that GHB left the system quickly. Users could party all night, sleep it off, and feel relatively normal the next day. No multi-day recovery period. No obvious hangover beyond some grogginess. Many users considered it safer than alcohol because it didn't damage the liver or cause violent behavior. The dosing nightmare from bodybuilding culture followed GHB into clubs. Ravers passed bottles around, each person taking a capful or a swig without knowing the concentration. Some bottles contained pharmaceutical-grade GHB at consistent strength. Others held homebrewed batches where potency varied wildly. The same amount that produced mild euphoria from one bottle could cause unconsciousness from another. Emergency medical technicians started seeing a new pattern outside nightclubs. Young people collapsed in club bathrooms or on dance floors, completely unresponsive, breathing shallowly. Their friends often panicked and delayed calling for help, fearing police involvement. By the time ambulances arrived, the user might be barely breathing or already starting to wake up. The phenomenon ravers called G'ing out became common enough that clubs developed informal protocols. Experienced users would recognize someone collapsing and move them to a quiet area, turn them on their side to prevent choking, and monitor breathing. Some venues kept the unconscious person comfortable until they woke up rather than calling ambulances. This DIY emergency medicine saved some lives and probably cost others. GHB's effects lasted roughly 3 to 4 hours, shorter than most club drugs. Users began redosing throughout the night to maintain the feeling. This practice multiplied the dangers exponentially. GHB accumulates in the system because the body needs time to metabolize each dose. Taking a second dose before the first cleared could push someone from euphoria to unconsciousness instantly. The club scene from Miami to New York to Chicago embraced GHB through the early 1990s. Gay clubs particularly appreciated its disinhibiting effects and sensory enhancement. Circuit parties, massive weekend-long events, became known for heavy GHB use. The substance fit perfectly with the culture of extended dancing, group experiences, and altered consciousness. Los Angeles and San Francisco developed particularly strong GHB cultures. Hollywood clubs, underground raves in warehouses, and beach parties all featured the clear liquid in circulation. Dealers operated openly in certain venues, carrying bottles in their pockets and selling doses for $10 to $20. Competition drove prices down in some areas to $5 per dose. The music influenced the experience profoundly. GHB enhanced the perception of bass frequencies, making the low-end thump of house and techno music feel like it was vibrating through the user's entire body. Ravers described the sensation of becoming one with the sound system, of feeling music rather than just hearing it. This synergy between drug and music created devoted users who couldn't imagine dancing without it. But the same properties that made GHB appealing for consensual use made it perfect for predatory behavior. The liquid was colorless, tasteless, and essentially odorless. Mixed into a cocktail or energy drink, it became completely undetectable. The dose that caused euphoria was only slightly less than the dose that caused unconsciousness. A person could feel fine one moment and collapse the next. The amnesia effect was particularly insidious. GHB disrupted memory formation at the neurological level, not just causing blackouts, but preventing memories from ever forming. Someone could be conscious, eyes open, even walking around, while later having zero recollection of events. This created a window where victims appeared functional but would remember nothing afterward. The first assault cases connected to GHB began appearing in the early 1990s, though many went unreported or unrecognized. Victims would wake up hours later in unfamiliar places with no memory of how they got there. Clear signs of sexual activity, and sometimes injuries they couldn't explain. The rapid metabolism meant GHB disappeared from their system before they reached a hospital or police station. College campuses became particular hotspots. Fraternity parties, dormitory gatherings, and bar scenes near universities saw clusters of incidents where students reported mysterious memory loss after accepting drinks. University health centers started seeing patterns. Young women arriving with post-assault trauma but no memory of the attack. Toxicology screens coming back negative because the substance had already cleared. The assault cases remained mostly hidden from public view through the mid-1990s. Victims often blamed themselves, wondering if they'd simply drunk too much alcohol. Police struggled to investigate crimes where the victim couldn't remember what happened and physical evidence was minimal. Perpetrators learned they could operate with near impunity as long as they waited 12 hours before the victim might seek help. Meanwhile, recreational use continued expanding. Rave culture went mainstream in the mid-1990s, moving from underground warehouses to commercial clubs and even some bars. GHB followed this migration, reaching new populations who knew nothing about proper dosing or the dangers of mixing substances. The user base shifted from experienced club kids who understood the risks to casual partiers, taking random doses from strangers. Ambulances became regular fixtures outside certain clubs on weekend nights. Emergency departments in major cities saw multiple GHB overdoses every weekend. Some hospitals developed specific protocols: intubate if breathing is dangerously slow, monitor in the emergency department, Let them wake up naturally since there's no reversal agent. Discharge when alert and stable. The invisible line between recreational use and predatory use blurred in crowded clubs where drinks got passed around, and nobody watched their cups carefully. Users dosing themselves for fun created cover for predators, dosing others for assault. The same bottle might serve both purposes in a single night. The substance's dual nature, simultaneously party drug and sexual assault tool, would soon explode into public consciousness in ways that would change drug policy forever. News media hadn't yet picked up the story. GHB remained unknown outside club culture and bodybuilding circles. But the cases were accumulating, the victims were multiplying, and eventually someone would connect the dots between the clear liquid and the epidemic of mysterious blackouts and assaults. That reckoning was coming faster than anyone realized. The first major media coverage hit in 1996, when a Texas college student went public with her story after a fraternity party attack. She remembered accepting a drink, feeling suddenly dizzy, and then nothing until waking up 12 hours later in a hospital with evidence of sexual assault. Hospital toxicology found no alcohol, no common drugs, nothing that explained her condition. A rape kit confirmed the assault but provided no leads on the perpetrator. Her case wasn't unique. Hundreds of similar reports were flooding police departments and campus security offices across America. The pattern was identical. Social setting, accepted drink, sudden incapacitation, memory blackout, waking up hours later with assault evidence. Law enforcement struggled because victims couldn't identify attackers they didn't remember seeing. Security cameras showed victims walking apparently normally, eliminating claims of obvious impairment. A Miami toxicologist finally made the connection after testing specifically for GHB in several assault cases. The substance appeared in samples that had been collected within hours of the attacks. She contacted local police, then media, explaining how a legal supplement was being weaponized for sexual assault. The story exploded regionally before going national within weeks. Network news divisions discovered GHB in late 1996 and early 1997. Dateline NBC produced a special investigation featuring assault survivors. 2020 followed with their own exposé. Local news stations in every major city ran special reports with ominous titles: The Rape Drug, Liquid Nightmare, The Predator's Drug of Choice. The coverage was sensational, frightening, and mostly accurate about the dangers while ignoring the recreational use context. The media focus transformed GHB overnight from an underground club drug into a national moral panic. Parents feared for their college-age children. Campus administrators sent warning emails. Bar owners started posting signs, "Watch your drink." The substance that had existed in relative obscurity for years suddenly became America's most talked-about drug threat. Oprah devoted an entire episode to date rape drugs in 1997. Assault survivors shared their stories on national television. The show focused heavily on GHB's properties: colorless, odorless, tasteless, memory erasing, rapidly metabolizing. Oprah's massive audience, predominantly women, learned that this substance could be slipped into any drink anywhere without detection. Congress reacted to the media coverage with hearings in 1997 and 1998. Survivors testified before committees. Law enforcement officials described the investigation challenges posed by a drug that disappeared from the body before victims even reported attacks. Prosecutors explained how impossible it was to prove assault when victims remembered nothing, and physical evidence was minimal. The hearings revealed disturbing statistics. Emergency departments reported thousands of suspected GHB cases annually, but most went unconfirmed because hospitals didn't test for it routinely. The substance required specific testing procedures and had to be detected within 12 to 24 hours. Standard drug screens missed it entirely. Victims arriving a day or two after assault had no physical proof the drugging ever occurred. College campuses became ground zero for the panic. Spring break destinations like Cancun, Panama City Beach, and South Padre Island saw spikes in reported incidents. Young women travelling in groups reported drinks being tampered with at bars and clubs. Some cases were confirmed. Others were likely alcohol-related but attributed to GHB amid the hysteria. Separating real incidents from panic became nearly impossible. The comparison to Rohypnol, flunitrazepam, another date rape drug, dominated media coverage. Rohypnol was a prescription sedative in Europe that had gained notoriety for similar predatory use. But GHB had significant advantages for criminals over Rohypnol. The liquid form mixed better than pills, which could leave residue. GHB metabolized faster, leaving the system in 12 hours versus Rohypnol's 72 hours. Most importantly, GHB caused more profound amnesia. Victims described the experience as losing chunks of time completely. Not fuzzy memories or vague recollections, but absolute blank spaces. Some could remember accepting a drink and then waking up hours later with nothing in between. Others had brief fragments, being in a car, lying down somewhere unfamiliar, but couldn't connect the pieces into a coherent narrative. The amnesia served criminals perfectly. Victims couldn't describe their attackers. They couldn't say where the assault occurred. They couldn't remember if other people were present. The investigation dead-ended immediately without victim testimony. Defense attorneys exploited this in the rare cases that went to trial, suggesting victims had simply drunk too much alcohol and regretted consensual encounters. Law enforcement agencies developed new protocols for suspected drug-facilitated assault cases. Collect urine samples immediately, rush toxicology testing, assume GHB unless proven otherwise. But even these measures often failed because victims typically didn't report for 24 to 48 hours after the substance had completely cleared. Police were trying to investigate crimes that left almost no trace. Campus police departments and city law enforcement began tracking GHB cases separately from other assaults. The numbers were staggering once agencies started looking specifically. One university in California documented 37 suspected cases in a single semester. A Florida beach town recorded over 100 during spring break season. The actual numbers were certainly higher since many victims never reported. Nightclub owners faced pressure to address the problem. Some venues installed lights over bars that supposedly revealed GHB in drinks, though these were largely ineffective. Others trained bartenders to watch for people doctoring drinks. A few clubs banned outside bottles entirely. Most changes were cosmetic rather than effective. The recreational club scene faced collateral damage from the assault coverage. Media reports rarely distinguished between people dosing themselves and people dosing others without consent. The entire culture of rave parties and electronic music became associated with predatory drugging. Club owners saw attendance drop. Some venues closed rather than deal with the stigma and liability. Harm reduction organizations found themselves in an impossible position. They wanted to provide honest drug information to reduce overdoses in the recreational community. But any information about GHB, including safety guidelines for voluntary users, was seen as enabling sexual assault. The moral panic made nuanced discussion nearly impossible. The assault cases that reached prosecution revealed disturbing patterns. Many perpetrators were repeat offenders who had refined their techniques over multiple attacks. They knew exactly how much GHB would incapacitate someone without causing obvious physical distress. They understood the timing, when to dose, how long to wait, when memory formation would stop. Some kept detailed notes about which victims remembered more or less. A Michigan case in 1998 finally resulted in a lengthy prison sentence when prosecutors found the defendant's apartment stocked with GHB, detailed journals describing multiple assaults, and video recordings of unconscious victims. The case demonstrated how GHB enabled serial predators to operate with minimal risk. The defendant had assaulted at least 15 women over 2 years before his arrest. Campus sexual assault advocates pointed out that GHB didn't create the problem of sexual assault. It just provided a new tool for existing predators. The same men who would have used alcohol or other forms of coercion now had a more effective method. The drug itself was neutral. Human intent determined its use. But this nuance got lost in the media narrative that presented GHB as uniquely evil. International attention followed the American coverage. British media ran their own investigations. Australian news programs featured local assault cases. European countries that had used GHB medically for decades suddenly reconsidered. The substance was transforming from a niche medical compound into a global symbol of predatory violence against women. The FDA issued stronger warnings in 1997, but the substance remained technically legal for several more years. The warning labels were pointless since most GHB was coming from underground laboratories, not legitimate manufacturers. The bottles circulating through clubs and college towns had no labels at all, just clear liquid in generic containers. Support groups formed for assault survivors dealing with GHB-related attacks. The therapeutic challenges were unique because victims had no memories to process. Traditional trauma therapy often involves working through traumatic memories. These victims had to cope with knowing something terrible happened while having no mental images or narrative. Some described it as worse than remembered trauma. The unknown was more terrifying than the known. The media coverage reached saturation by 1999. Every major magazine, newspaper and television news program had run features on GHB and date rape drugs. Public awareness was at an all-time high. Parents warned daughters, universities held mandatory seminars, bars posted warnings. Yet the attacks continued because awareness doesn't stop determined criminals, and the drug remained readily available through underground channels that operated beyond public view or legal reach. The FDA finally banned GHB completely in March 1990, though the ban proved toothless until Congress intervened with federal criminal legislation years later. The initial prohibition applied only to interstate commerce and distribution, leaving enormous loopholes that underground manufacturers exploited immediately. Health food stores removed GHB from shelves, but the substance simply migrated entirely to black markets, where it had already been thriving alongside legitimate supplement sales. Congress passed the Hillary J. Farias and Samantha Reed Date Rape Prevention Act in February 2000, naming the law after 2 teenage girls who died from GHB overdoses. The legislation made GHB a Schedule I-controlled substance, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs with no accepted medical use and high abuse potential. Possession carried the same penalties as heroin or LSD. Using GHB to facilitate sexual assault added 20 years to federal sentences. The law included an exception that would later create a bizarre contradiction. GHB could remain Schedule III for legitimate medical purposes if FDA approved. This carve-out anticipated future pharmaceutical development, while punishing recreational and criminal use. The dual scheduling meant the same molecule existed in 2 completely different legal categories, depending on context, a regulatory absurdity that persists today. Law enforcement celebrated the Schedule I designation as a major victory. Prosecutors could now charge dealers and users with serious federal crimes. Police departments trained officers to recognize GHB in liquid form. Drug task forces added it to their priority lists. The criminal justice system geared up to fight a newly illegal substance that had been proliferating for over a decade. But prohibition created exactly the problem drug policy experts had predicted. Manufacturers simply switched to legal precursor chemicals that the body metabolized into GHB. The two main precursors, gamma-butyrolactone, GBL, and 1,4-butanediol, 1,4-BD, were common industrial solvents used in manufacturing processes worldwide. GBL cleaned circuit boards, removed graffiti, and served as a chemical intermediate in plastics production. 1,4-BD was used in automotive and industrial applications. The human body converted both precursors into GHB through normal metabolic processes. Drinking GBL or 1,4-BD produced identical effects to taking GHB directly because they became GHB inside the body. The conversion happened quickly, within 15 to 30 minutes. Users couldn't tell the difference between consuming GHB and consuming its precursors. Online vendors immediately began marketing GBL and 1,4-BD as solvent, cleaner, or supplement with transparent wink-wink descriptions. Websites sold 1,4-BD as Thunder Nectar or Serenity, GBL as Blue Nitro or Renutrient. Product descriptions avoided explicit drug claims while making the intended use obvious. Great for relaxation and sleep, not for human consumption. The contradiction was blatant and legally meaningless since the chemicals themselves weren't controlled. Chemistry forums and drug websites provided detailed conversion information. Users learned that GBL was more potent than GHB, requiring smaller doses. 1,4-BD was slightly less potent but still effective. The precursors had worse taste. GBL tasted like industrial chemicals because it was an industrial chemical, but mixing it with juice or energy drinks masked the flavour adequately. The DA recognised the loophole and moved to control GBL in 2000, declaring it an immediate precursor to GHB and therefore subject to the same Schedule I restrictions. But enforcement proved nearly impossible. Legitimate industrial users needed GBL for manufacturing. Chemical suppliers couldn't distinguish between buyers using it for legal purposes and those converting it to drugs. The substance flowed through normal commercial channels while being diverted to underground drug markets. Manufacturers adapted faster than regulators could respond. When GBL became controlled, 1,4-BD sales increased. When DEA threatened 1,4-BD, new precursors emerged. The fundamental problem was chemistry. GHB's molecular structure was simple enough that numerous related compounds could serve as precursors. Banning one just shifted demand to another. Underground production became more sophisticated rather than less after federal prohibition. Home laboratories upgraded their equipment and techniques. Amateur cooks studied chemistry seriously, learning proper synthesis procedures. Quality varied enormously, but successful manufacturers produced GHB that was chemically indistinguishable from pharmaceutical preparations. The black market price increased predictably after prohibition. Pre-ban GHB sold for $5 to $20 per dose depending on location. Post-ban prices jumped to $15 to $40. Higher prices attracted more dealers while making the market more profitable for manufacturers. Prohibition created exactly the economic incentives that fuel successful black markets. Online sales exploded through the early 2000s. Websites based overseas sold GBL and 1,4-BD to American customers without legal consequences. Credit card processors and payment services facilitated transactions. Packages arrived via international mail with customs declarations listing them as cleaning products or solvents. The global nature of internet commerce defeated domestic drug laws. Law enforcement struggled with the new reality. Officers could arrest someone possessing GHB, but had difficulty proving that GBL or 1,4-BD bottles were intended for human consumption. Prosecutors needed evidence beyond possession, usually sales conversations or dosing instructions. Defendants claimed they used the chemicals for cleaning or industrial purposes. Juries couldn't always tell the difference. Emergency departments developed new protocols for GHB and precursor overdoses. The symptoms were identical since the chemicals became GHB in the body. Treatment remained supportive. Protect the airway, monitor breathing, wait for the patient to metabolize and wake up naturally. No reversal agent existed. Doctors could only provide supportive care while the drug cleared the system. The medical community recognized a troubling pattern. GHB overdoses were increasing despite prohibition. The ban hadn't reduced use. It had simply moved all use to unregulated black markets. Recreational users who previously bought consistent products from health food stores now consumed unknown concentrations from unknown sources. Overdose rates climbed because quality control had disappeared entirely. Harm reduction advocates found themselves vindicated but ignored. They had predicted that prohibition without reducing demand would increase danger by eliminating any quality standards. Policymakers focused on criminal penalties rather than public health approaches. The result was more emergency room visits, more overdoses, and continued sexual assault cases despite harsher laws. Addiction treatment specialists began seeing patients dependent on GHB with increasing frequency. The addiction was severe, developing faster than with many other substances. Users who took GHB daily for several weeks or months became physically dependent. Attempts to quit caused profound withdrawal. Severe anxiety, insomnia, tremors, rapid heart rate, and potentially life-threatening seizures. GHB withdrawal rivaled alcohol and benzodiazepine withdrawal for severity, among the most dangerous withdrawal syndromes known to medicine. Patients required careful medical detoxification, usually involving benzodiazepines to prevent seizures. The withdrawal timeline was brutal. Symptoms peaked within 2 to 4 days and could last weeks. Many users relapsed simply to avoid the misery of quitting. Treatment facilities developed specific protocols for GHB detoxification. The process required inpatient monitoring because outpatient detoxification was too dangerous. Withdrawal seizures could be fatal without immediate medical intervention. Some addiction specialists considered GHB among the hardest addictions to treat successfully because the substance was psychologically compelling and the withdrawal was medically dangerous. The underground economy developed its own infrastructure. Suppliers established distribution networks moving precursor chemicals from chemical companies to dealers. Manufacturers operated mobile laboratories, moving locations frequently to avoid detection. Dealers specialized in specific markets, campus parties, nightclubs, the gay club scene, or general street sales. Prison sentences for GHB trafficking reflected the federal sentencing guidelines for Schedule I drugs. First-time offenders received years in federal prison. Repeat offenders faced decades. Using GHB in the commission of another crime, particularly sexual assault, added mandatory minimums that totaled life-destroying sentences. The criminal penalties were harsh enough to deter some dealers, while making the market lucrative enough to attract replacements. The international dimension complicated enforcement further. Precursor chemicals manufactured in China, India, or Eastern Europe flowed to American buyers through complex supply chains. Customs inspectors couldn't examine every package. Chemical identification required testing that was time-consuming and expensive. Most shipments entered the country without inspection. By the mid-2000s, GHB had transformed from a legal supplement into a completely underground drug that was nonetheless widely available to anyone who knew where to look. The ban had failed to eliminate use while successfully eliminating any remaining quality control. The criminal penalties were severe in theory, but difficult to enforce in practice. The assault cases continued, the overdoses multiplied, the addiction cases increased, Prohibition had created all the predicted problems while solving none of the actual issues. The gay club scene had been using GHB since the early 1990s, but the late 1990s and 2000s transformed casual use into something darker and more compulsive. The term chemsex emerged in London before spreading globally, describing sex facilitated or enhanced by specific drugs, primarily GHB, methamphetamine, and mephedrone. GHB became the cornerstone of this subculture because its disinhibiting effects removed psychological barriers while enhancing physical sensation. Circuit parties, massive weekend-long dance events drawing thousands of gay men to destinations like Miami, Palm Springs, and Ibiza, became synonymous with heavy GHB use. These marathon events stretched from Friday night through Sunday morning with minimal breaks. Attendees danced for 20 to 30 hours, fueled by combinations of stimulants and GHB that kept energy high while maintaining euphoria. The dosing patterns at circuit parties were particularly dangerous. Users would take GHB every 2 to 3 hours throughout the weekend to maintain effects. This frequent redosing meant constant GHB presence in the bloodstream with accumulating concentrations. The fine line between euphoria and unconsciousness disappeared after multiple doses. Emergency medical tents at circuit parties became as essential as sound systems. Medical personnel working these events reported staggering numbers of GHB overdoses. One circuit party in Miami saw 37 emergency interventions in a single weekend. Most involved unconscious attendees who had taken too much GHB or combined it with other substances. The medical teams developed specialized protocols: check breathing, secure airway if needed, monitor until consciousness returns, discharge when stable. The chemsex phenomenon extended beyond circuit parties into private gatherings and apps facilitating drug-fueled sexual encounters. Grindr, Scruff, and similar platforms allowed users to find partners specifically for chemsex sessions. Profiles explicitly mentioned party and play, or used coded language like looking for generous friends. These sessions could last 12 to 72 hours with continuous drug use and sexual activity. GHB's specific effects made it ideal for chemsex beyond simple disinhibition. The substance increased tactile sensitivity, making physical touch more intense. It reduced anxiety and self-consciousness that might interfere with sexual connection. At moderate doses, it enhanced arousal while delaying orgasm. The combination of effects created experiences users described as transcendent or transformative. But the same properties that enhance consensual encounters created vulnerability in situations where consent was ambiguous or absent. GHB's profound effects on memory and consciousness made it difficult to establish what happened during sessions where all participants were heavily intoxicated. Questions of consent became muddled when someone couldn't remember agreeing to specific acts but had been conscious and seemingly willing at the time. The polysubstance combinations popular in chemsex were medically catastrophic. Mixing GHB with methamphetamine, a common practice called slamming G, combined a powerful depressant with a powerful stimulant. The meth kept users awake and active while GHB suppressed breathing. Users could stop breathing without realizing it because the stimulant masked the sedation. Deaths from this combination accumulated steadily. Alcohol combined with GHB was even more dangerous since both substances depressed the central nervous system synergistically. 1 + 1 didn't equal 2. It equaled 4 or 5 in terms of respiratory depression. The combination could stop breathing entirely. Emergency rooms saw regular cases of near-fatal overdoses, where blood work showed both GHB and significant alcohol levels. London's chemsex scene became particularly problematic by the mid-2000s. Sexual health clinics reported alarming patterns: increased HIV and hepatitis C transmission during chemsex sessions, injection drug use leading to infections, and severe GHB addiction requiring intensive treatment. The National Health Service established specialized clinics to address chemsex-related health problems as standard addiction services proved inadequate. Users developed tolerance rapidly with frequent dosing. Someone might start with 2 grams for desired effects, but need 4 or 5 grams after several months of regular use. Higher doses meant greater risk of overdose and deeper physical dependence. Many users found themselves trapped in escalating consumption patterns they couldn't control. The withdrawal from chronic GHB use was brutal enough that users continued dosing simply to avoid it. Some users took GHB every 2 to 3 hours around the clock, setting alarms to wake during the night for doses. Missing a scheduled dose triggered the beginning of withdrawal, anxiety, tremors, rapid heartbeat, insomnia. The only relief came from taking more GHB. Circuit party culture developed its own harm reduction strategies out of necessity. Experienced users learned to G-sit, watching over friends who had taken GHB to ensure they kept breathing. Some groups designated sober monitors, whose job was preventing overdoses rather than partying. These informal systems saved lives but couldn't prevent all disasters. The medical community struggled to engage with chemsex culture effectively. Doctors wanted to warn about dangers, but moralistic approaches pushed users away from seeking help. Public health campaigns tried threading the needle between acknowledging the reality of chemsex while discouraging the most dangerous practices. The messaging satisfied no one. Users felt judged while health officials felt ignored. Addiction specialists recognized that GHB dependence in the chemsex community differed from other addictions in important ways. The drug wasn't just physiologically addictive, it was psychologically tied to sexual identity, social connection, and community belonging. Quitting meant potentially losing one's entire social network. Treatment required addressing not just the substance, but the entire lifestyle. Some users managed GHB successfully for years without major problems. They measured doses carefully, avoided mixing substances, and never dosed alone. These functional users demonstrated that GHB could be used without inevitable disaster. But their existence created a dangerous example. Newcomers assumed they could also use safely without realizing the extensive experience and discipline required. The deaths mounted slowly but steadily. Young men died alone in apartments after chemsex sessions. Others overdosed at parties surrounded by people who didn't call ambulances until too late. Some died from combinations of substances that should never be mixed. Each death sent ripples through the community but rarely changed behavior patterns in lasting ways. New York's chemsex scene developed particularly high-risk behaviors. Private sex parties featured open drug use with minimal safety precautions. Attendees sometimes arrived already intoxicated and continued dosing throughout. The apartments hosting these gatherings became known to regular paramedics, who responded to repeated overdose calls at the same addresses. San Francisco's circuit party scene evolved its own specific GHB culture. The city's massive events like Door Alley and Folsom Street Fair attracted users from across the country. The weekend parties created temporary communities where GHB use was normalized and expected. Medical volunteers worked overtime treating overdoses, dehydration, and drug interactions. Dating apps accelerated the spread of chemsex culture by making it easier to find like-minded partners. The apps removed barriers to connecting with other users interested in drug-facilitated encounters. What might have once required knowing the right people or visiting specific venues now required only a smartphone and a profile. The democratization of access meant more users and more risk. Berlin emerged as Europe's chemsex capital, with clubs operating continuously from Friday through Monday morning. The city's permissive drug culture and thriving gay scene created perfect conditions for GHB proliferation. German emergency services developed specific expertise in GHB overdose treatment from sheer volume of cases. Australia's circuit party scene, particularly Sydney's Mardi Gras, saw similar patterns of heavy GHB use and associated problems. Ambulance services reported that GHB cases had become their most common drug-related emergency during major events. The substance had displaced alcohol as the primary substance causing emergency interventions. The chemsex phenomenon revealed how GHB's effects could create intensely compelling experiences that users struggled to replicate without the drug. Many reported that sex without GHB felt disappointing or anxiety-inducing compared to enhanced experiences. This psychological dependence was as powerful as physical addiction and more difficult to treat. By the late 2000s, GHB had become so embedded in certain segments of gay club culture that abstaining meant being an outsider. The social pressure to participate was subtle but constant. Newcomers learned quickly that GHB was part of the scene rather than an addition to it. Resisting this normalization required strong social support and clear personal boundaries. Europe's electronic music festivals became the next major frontier for GHB expansion in the mid-2000s. Tomorrowland in Belgium, Awakenings in the Netherlands, and Berghain's marathon sessions in Berlin attracted hundreds of thousands of attendees who viewed drug use as integral to the experience rather than incidental. GHB arrived at these venues through networks that operated across borders with greater efficiency than national law enforcement could counter. The Netherlands developed a particularly robust GHB culture, despite, or perhaps because of, the country's pragmatic drug policies. Dutch harm reduction organisations distributed testing kits and educational materials while emergency services refined overdose protocols. Amsterdam's nightlife scene normalised GHB to the extent that naloxone stations designed for opioid overdoses began stocking equipment specifically for GHB-related emergencies. British clubbers adopted the term G so universally that most users under 30 had never heard the full chemical name. London, Manchester, and Brighton saw concentrated GHB use in specific venues where dealers operated with near impunity. The substance's liquid form allowed users to dose openly in club bathrooms without the suspicious behaviour associated with snorting or swallowing pills. The United Kingdom's National Health Service published a landmark study in 2008 showing that GHB-related emergency department visits had increased by 300% over 5 years. The data contradicted official government claims that drug use was declining. Hospital staff in major cities reported that Friday and Saturday night shifts routinely involved treating multiple GHB overdoses alongside the usual alcohol cases. Scotland faced a unique GHB crisis when the substance spread rapidly through Glasgow's club scene and into surrounding areas. Scottish emergency services recorded some of Europe's highest per capita GHB overdose rates. The concentrated urban geography meant that single hospitals handled dozens of cases during busy weekends. Medical staff developed dark humour about the G ward, the section of the emergency department that filled with unconscious users every weekend. Australia termed GHB fantasy, in a linguistic twist that reflected both the substance's euphoric effects and its dissociative properties. Sydney and Melbourne became Australian epicentres where the drug proliferated through gay clubs before spreading to mainstream venues. Australian law enforcement struggled with GHB trafficking because most production occurred domestically using legally imported precursor chemicals rather than finished products smuggled across borders. The Australian government's response involved aggressive prosecution paired with public health campaigns. Sentences for GHB trafficking were harsh, often exceeding those for heroin or cocaine. Yet production continued because the profit margins justified the legal risks. Underground chemists could manufacture a kilogram of GHB for a few $100s in raw materials and sell it for $10,000 or more. New Zealand experienced a delayed but intense GHB wave beginning around 2010. The substance arrived through Australian connections and spread rapidly through Wellington and Auckland's nightlife. New Zealand's smaller population meant that cultural shifts happened faster. GHB went from unknown to prevalent in certain scenes within 2 to 3 years. Emergency services initially struggled to recognise GHB overdoses because they had minimal prior experience. South Africa's club scene in Cape Town and Johannesburg adopted GHB from European and American trends. The substance fit perfectly into the country's vibrant electronic music culture and upscale party scene. South African law enforcement had limited experience with GHB, making prosecution difficult even when arrests occurred. Most police officers couldn't identify the clear liquid as a drug without chemical testing. Asian countries largely resisted GHB's spread due to different club cultures and stricter drug enforcement. Japan, South Korea and Singapore maintained harsh penalties for any drug possession, creating strong deterrents. However, Thailand's party destinations like Bangkok and Phuket saw GHB emerge in tourist areas where Western visitors brought the substance or sought it from local dealers who adapted their inventory to tourist demands. Russia developed a significant GHB problem in Moscow and St. Petersburg despite draconian drug laws. The substance's liquid form made it easier to transport and conceal than pills or powders. Russian emergency services dealt with GHB cases using protocols developed for alcohol poisoning since the symptoms overlapped. The cultural acceptance of heavy drinking meant that GHB-intoxicated individuals often went unrecognized until they became dangerously unresponsive. Each country's GHB culture developed distinct characteristics based on local drug traditions and enforcement patterns. British users preferred mixing GHB with energy drinks. Dutch users took it in small measured doses throughout the night. Australian users combined it with stimulants more frequently than Europeans. American chemsex culture involved higher doses and longer sessions than comparable European scenes. The dark web revolutionized GHB distribution in the early 2010s when Silk Road and similar marketplaces enabled anonymous purchasing with cryptocurrency. Vendors offered GHB, GBL, and 1,4-BD with customer reviews, quality ratings, and competitive pricing. The online markets made the substance accessible to anyone with basic computer skills, regardless of social connections to dealers. International mail became the primary trafficking method for precursor chemicals. Chinese chemical companies shipped GBL globally, with vague customs declarations listing it as industrial solvent. Packages arrived at residential addresses with minimal scrutiny. Customs inspectors couldn't test every international package, and GBL was legal for industrial purposes, making interdiction nearly impossible. European law enforcement agencies attempted coordinated responses through Europol, sharing intelligence about manufacturers and trafficking routes. Joint operations occasionally seized large quantities of precursors or finished GHB. These interdictions created temporary supply disruptions, but never significantly reduced availability. New suppliers emerged within weeks to fill any gaps. Germany's festival scene developed specialized medical teams that traveled between major electronic music events, providing harm reduction services and emergency care. These teams saw the full spectrum of GHB use: functional users taking measured doses, recreational users misjudging amounts, and severe overdoses requiring hospitalization. The medical personnel reported that GHB had become more common than MDMA at certain festivals by 2015. Scandinavian countries experienced later but intense GHB adoption. Sweden's underground club scene embraced the substance despite the country's strict drug laws and cultural conservatism regarding intoxication. Norwegian authorities reported increasing GHB cases in Oslo and Bergen. Denmark's permissive Copenhagen nightlife saw heavy use in specific venues catering to electronic music enthusiasts. The Czech Republic emerged as a significant European production centre for GHB and its precursors. Czech chemical companies manufactured GBL legally for export, while some production was diverted to underground drug markets. The country's central location and developed chemical industry made it an ideal hub for distribution throughout Europe. Regional slang proliferated as GHB spread globally. British users called it G or Gina. Australians said fantasy. Americans used liquid ecstasy or liquid G. Germans called it liquid ecstasy as well, but pronounced it with German phonetics. The multiple names created confusion for parents, educators, and law enforcement trying to understand what substances young people were discussing. Online forums and social media enabled global knowledge sharing about GHB. Users exchanged information about dosing, effects, combinations, and risks across international boundaries. A harm reduction tip developed in Amsterdam could reach Sydney within hours. This rapid information flow meant that regional variations in GHB culture became less distinct over time, as global best practices and worst habits spread uniformly. The boutique GHB market emerged in the late 2010s, with dealers marketing pharmaceutical grade or premium GHB at higher prices. These claims were usually false. Underground GHB had no quality standards, but users paid premium prices for perceived safety. Some dealers actually did provide more consistent products through better chemistry, creating a two-tier market where sophisticated users sought reliable sources. Flavored GHB preparations appeared to mask the substance's chemical taste. Dealers added fruit flavoring, sweeteners, or mixed GHB with energy drinks before sale. These preparations made the substance more palatable, but also more dangerous because users couldn't judge concentration by taste. A sweet-tasting mixture might contain a massive dose. International sporting events became unexpected GHB hotspots. The World Cup, Olympics, and major soccer tournaments attracted massive crowds of young people seeking to party alongside sporting competitions. GHB dealers followed these events, setting up temporary distribution networks in host cities. Law enforcement focused on terrorism and violence, giving drug dealers operational freedom. Brazil's growing electronic music scene imported GHB culture from Europe and the United States. São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro developed their own chemsex communities and club scenes, where GHB became available through international connections. Brazilian law enforcement had minimal experience with the substance, making prosecution difficult even when police made arrests. Mexico's border cities saw GHB emerge in nightlife districts catering to American tourists. Tijuana, Cancun, and Cabo San Lucas dealers added GHB to their inventory, alongside traditional offerings like cocaine and marijuana. Spring break destinations became particular hotspots, where American college students encountered GHB in less regulated environments than domestic clubs. The global spread created a situation where GHB was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, prevalent in specific subcultures and venues while remaining unknown to the general population. A teenager in Kansas might never encounter it while a clubgoer in Berlin took it weekly. The fragmented distribution meant that educational efforts struggled because the audience wasn't uniform. Jazz Pharmaceuticals submitted a new drug application to the FDA in 2001 for sodium oxybate, pharmaceutical-grade GHB, under the brand name Xyrem. The application created an immediate controversy. How could the federal government approve a medication that was simultaneously classified as Schedule 1 with no accepted medical use? The answer required legal gymnastics that exposed the arbitrary nature of drug scheduling. The FDA's Peripheral and Central Nervous System Advisory Committee reviewed the application with unusual scrutiny. Narcolepsy patients testified about their desperate need for effective treatment. Current medications controlled daytime sleep attacks, but did nothing for the fragmented nighttime sleep that left patients exhausted. Xerem's clinical trials showed remarkable improvements in sleep quality and daytime functioning that no other drug could match. The committee faced an uncomfortable reality. GHB worked. It genuinely helped narcolepsy patients in ways that were medically significant and clinically measurable. The science was solid despite the substance's reputation as a date rape drug and party substance. Denying approval would punish sick patients for the recreational and criminal misuse by others. FDA approved Xyrem in July 2002 with unprecedented restrictions. The drug would be Schedule III, a lower restriction than Schedule Y, but only when prescribed for approved medical conditions. The same molecule remained Schedule Y for any other purpose. This dual scheduling created a legal framework where context determined classification rather than chemistry. Jazz Pharmaceuticals established the most restrictive distribution system ever implemented for a prescription medication. Only one centralized pharmacy in the entire United States could dispense Xyrem. Doctors had to register with the manufacturer before prescribing. Patients enrolled in a mandatory tracking system. Every dose was monitored from manufacture to consumption. The distribution restrictions served multiple purposes. They prevented diversion to recreational use by creating a complete paper trail. They ensured patient education about proper dosing and risks. They satisfied regulators' concerns about approving a notorious substance. The system worked but created enormous barriers for patients who desperately needed the medication. Insurance companies initially refused to cover Xyrem because of its controversial nature and astronomical cost. The medication's price exceeded $3,000 monthly, making it one of America's most expensive prescriptions. Jazz Pharmaceuticals argued that manufacturing costs and distribution system expenses justified the pricing. Critics noted that underground GHB cost almost nothing and provided identical effects. Narcolepsy patients became unexpected advocates for a substance most people considered purely harmful. Patient organizations emphasized that GHB's medical utility existed independently from its abuse potential. They pointed out that many effective medications, morphine, amphetamine, benzodiazepines, were also misused recreationally without eliminating their medical value. The pharmaceutical industry watched the Xyrem approval carefully as a test case for rehabilitating stigmatized substances. If GHB could transition from Schedule I street drug to approved medicine, perhaps other controversial substances deserved reconsideration. The precedent suggested that scientific evidence could overcome cultural panic if the process was managed correctly. Xyrem's clinical effects in narcolepsy patients were dramatic enough to silence most medical skepticism. Patients who had struggled with sleep disruption for years reported their first restful nights in decades. Daytime functioning improved as nighttime sleep quality increased. The medication didn't cure narcolepsy, but managed symptoms better than any alternative. Some patients experienced side effects: nausea, dizziness, bedwetting, sleepwalking. The worst side effect occurred when patients took excessive doses or combined Xyrem with alcohol despite explicit warnings. A handful of deaths occurred in patients who violated the prescribing guidelines, fueling arguments that GHB was too dangerous for medical use regardless of benefits. The dual scheduling created bizarre legal situations. A person possessing pharmaceutical Xyrem with a legitimate prescription was legal. Someone possessing chemically identical GHB without a prescription faced Schedule I trafficking charges. The molecule was the same, only the context differed. This inconsistency highlighted how drug laws often reflected politics more than pharmacology. Underground GHB users noticed the approval with dark humor. The date rape drug had become FDA-approved medicine while remaining a severely punished street drug. Some users pointed to Xyrem as evidence that prohibition was hypocritical. The government admitted GHB was safe and effective medicine, while imprisoning people for possessing it. Jazz Pharmaceuticals' financial success with Xyrem was extraordinary. Annual sales eventually exceeded $1 billion, making it one of the pharmaceutical industry's most profitable drugs. The company's stock price soared. Investors loved the combination of limited competition, high prices, and patent protection for a Schedule III medication. Generic manufacturers couldn't easily compete because Xyrem's distribution restrictions created regulatory barriers beyond normal generic approval. The single centralized pharmacy system gave Jazz Pharmaceuticals a structural monopoly. Generic GHB would theoretically cost less, but couldn't use the same distribution network. Narcolepsy patients faced insurance battles to access Xyrem even after FDA approval. Many insurers required trying other medications first, despite weaker evidence for those alternatives. Prior authorization processes delayed treatment for months. Some patients gave up and continued suffering rather than fighting the bureaucratic obstacles. The medical community remained divided about Xyrem. Sleep specialists who treated narcolepsy embraced it as a genuine breakthrough. Addiction specialists worried it normalized a dangerous substance. Emergency physicians who treated GHB overdoses found the approval baffling. The drug's reputation varied completely depending on which medical specialty was discussing it. Patient advocacy groups fought to expand Xyrem's approved indications beyond narcolepsy. Some physicians prescribed it off-label for fibromyalgia, alcohol withdrawal, and other conditions where sleep disturbance played a central role. These uses lacked FDA approval, but showed promise in small studies and case reports. The pharmaceutical approval had zero impact on recreational GHB use or sexual assault cases. Street users didn't suddenly switch to expensive prescription Xyrem. Predators didn't seek legitimate prescriptions before drugging victims. The two worlds, medical and criminal, remained completely separate despite involving identical substances. Jazz Pharmaceuticals faced ethical criticism for profiting from a substance that caused enormous social harm when used recreationally. The company argued they weren't responsible for illegal use and pointed to their distribution restrictions as evidence of responsible stewardship. Critics noted that GHB's medical approval provided cover for continued underground manufacturing. Some countries refused to approve Xyrem despite FDA authorization. Regulatory agencies in several European nations decided the abuse potential outweighed medical benefits even for narcolepsy. These countries continued treating GHB purely as a dangerous drug while Americans could legally obtain it with prescriptions. The Xyrem paradox illustrated a fundamental tension in drug policy. Substances aren't inherently good or evil. Chemistry is morally neutral. Outcomes depend on dose, context, intent, and control. GHB could restore sleep to suffering patients or render assault victims unconscious. The molecule didn't change. Human choices determined its effects. Insurance coverage gradually improved as Xyrem demonstrated long-term safety and efficacy. More narcolepsy patients gained access despite the medication's cost. Quality of life improvements were substantial enough that health economists calculated Xyrem actually saved money by reducing disability and healthcare utilization from untreated narcolepsy. By 2010, thousands of Americans were legally taking pharmaceutical GHB nightly, while thousands more were illegally using chemically identical substances for recreational predation. The same molecule served completely different purposes simultaneously. This duality captured everything complicated about America's relationship with consciousness-altering substances, the refusal to acknowledge that context matters more than chemistry, that prohibition creates problems it claims to solve, and that scientific evidence rarely overcomes cultural panic regardless of how strong the data might be. The death count accumulated slowly enough that no single statistic captured GHB's human cost, but emergency department records painted a grim picture when examined collectively. Between 1995 and 2005, American hospitals documented over 15,000 GHB-related emergency visits, resulting in at least 72 confirmed deaths. The actual numbers were certainly higher because many cases went unrecognized or were misattributed to alcohol or unknown causes. Respiratory depression killed most victims when GHB combined with alcohol or other depressants. The synergistic effect meant that moderate doses of each substance together produced profound sedation that neither would cause alone. Users stopped breathing in their sleep, at parties, or in cars. Friends often assumed the person was simply sleeping off intoxication, rather than dying from oxygen deprivation. Brain damage from repeated overdoses created a population of survivors with permanent cognitive deficits. Oxygen deprivation during prolonged unconsciousness damaged the hippocampus and frontal cortex, regions responsible for memory and executive function. Some former heavy users struggled with short-term memory formation, making it difficult to maintain employment or relationships years after quitting. The memory problems were particularly cruel because they mimicked the acute amnesia GHB caused. Former users couldn't remember whether they'd locked doors, taken medication, or had conversations. Some developed compensatory strategies like obsessive note-taking. Others simply accepted diminished cognitive function as the permanent price of past drug use. Sexual assault survivors faced unique psychological challenges when GHB had been used against them. Traditional trauma therapy often involves processing traumatic memories through repeated exposure and reframing. These survivors had no memories to process, just blank spaces where their assaults occurred. The unknown became more terrifying than remembered trauma because imagination filled the gaps with worst-case scenarios. Some survivors developed strategies to cope with their missing memories. They focused on the concrete evidence, medical records, police reports, their own physical injuries. They acknowledged that something terrible happened without torturing themselves trying to remember specifics. Others became obsessed with recovering lost memories through hypnosis or therapy, rarely succeeding because the memories simply never formed neurologically. The trauma manifested as hypervigilance around drinks and social situations. Survivors watched their beverages constantly, never accepting drinks from others, sometimes avoiding bars and clubs entirely. Trust became nearly impossible when the violation occurred during vulnerability they couldn't even remember. Relationships suffered as survivors struggled with intimacy and control issues stemming from their assaults. GHB addiction proved extraordinarily difficult to treat because the withdrawal syndrome was among medicine's most dangerous. Patients who stopped using after months or years of daily consumption experienced severe anxiety, insomnia, tremors, rapid heartbeat, and potentially fatal seizures. The withdrawal timeline was vicious. Symptoms began within 2 to 6 hours of the last dose, peaked at 2 to 3 days, and could persist for weeks. Treatment facilities compared GHB withdrawal to alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal in severity, significantly worse than opioid withdrawal despite opioids' reputation for difficulty. Medical detoxification required careful benzodiazepine administration to prevent seizures while monitoring cardiovascular function. Some patients needed intensive care during acute withdrawal when complications developed. The addiction itself developed with terrifying speed compared to other substances. Someone using GHB recreationally on weekends could progress to daily use within months, then hourly dosing within a year. The psychological compulsion combined with rapid tolerance meant users needed increasingly frequent doses to avoid withdrawal while chasing diminishing euphoria. Chronic users describe their lives becoming structured entirely around GHB dosing schedules. They set alarms every 2 to 3 hours, including throughout the night, to maintain blood levels and prevent withdrawal. Missing a dose by 30 minutes triggered anxiety and physical discomfort. Their existence narrowed to obtaining, measuring, and consuming GHB, while everything else, career, relationships, health, deteriorated. Some addicted users required medical intervention because attempting to quit alone was potentially lethal. Emergency departments saw patients arriving in severe withdrawal, seizing, hallucinating, experiencing dangerous cardiac arrhythmias. These medical crises required immediate benzodiazepine administration and sometimes intensive care admission. The mortality rate during unsupervised GHB withdrawal was significant, though difficult to quantify. Long-term users who successfully quit described the recovery process as brutal. The acute withdrawal lasted days to weeks, but post-acute withdrawal syndrome persisted for months. Depression, anxiety, and sleep disturbances continued long after physical dependence resolved. Many relapsed not to chase euphoria, but simply to escape the grinding misery of protracted withdrawal. Addiction specialists developed GHB-specific treatment protocols because standard approaches proved inadequate. The protocols emphasized medical detoxification, intensive monitoring during early recovery, and long-term psychological support for managing triggers and cravings. Success rates remained discouragingly low. Many patients cycled through treatment multiple times before achieving lasting sobriety. Support groups specifically for GHB addiction emerged online and in major cities where use was concentrated. These groups shared strategies that worked: tapering schedules to reduce withdrawal severity, distraction techniques during acute cravings, rebuilding lives that addiction had destroyed. The community provided something treatment centers couldn't: understanding from people who had experienced the same specific hell. Brain imaging studies of chronic GHB users revealed concerning patterns. PET scans showed reduced glucose metabolism in frontal regions, indicating decreased brain activity even during abstinence. MRI studies documented slight volume reductions in the hippocampus and cortex. These changes might be permanent or might recover with extended sobriety. Longitudinal studies were still ongoing. Cognitive testing of recovered users showed persistent deficits in working memory, attention, and executive function compared to control groups. The deficits were subtle enough to go unnoticed in casual interaction, but significant enough to impair complex tasks. Former users struggled with jobs requiring sustained attention, or multitasking even years after quitting. The cardiovascular system took damage from chronic GHB use that manifested as cardiac arrhythmias and cardiomyopathy in some heavy users. The mechanism wasn't fully understood, but repeated extreme fluctuations in heart rate during use and withdrawal appeared to strain cardiac tissue. Some former users developed chronic heart problems requiring ongoing medical management. Liver damage occurred less frequently than with alcohol but still affected some chronic users. GHB metabolism stressed hepatic enzymes, and some users developed elevated liver enzymes or mild cirrhosis. The damage was usually less severe than alcohol-induced liver disease, but still required monitoring and potentially treatment. The social costs were harder to quantify, but equally devastating. Families destroyed by a member's addiction and the behaviors it produced. Careers derailed by arrests, overdoses, or simply the inability to function while addicted. Relationships shattered by the lying, stealing, and manipulation that addiction generated. The ripples extended far beyond individual users. Children of GHB-addicted parents faced neglect when parents prioritized dosing schedules over childcare. Some witnessed their parents' overdoses or withdrawal seizures, creating lasting psychological trauma. Child Protective Services in cities with concentrated GHB use reported increasing removals related to parental substance abuse involving GHB specifically. Healthcare systems absorbed enormous costs from GHB-related emergencies, addiction treatment, and long-term complications. A single overdose requiring emergency department care and monitoring costs several $1,000s. Multiply that by thousands of cases annually, add intensive care admissions and addiction treatment, and the financial burden reached hundreds of millions. The criminal justice costs added another layer: arrests, prosecutions, imprisonment, and supervision of GHB users and dealers. Incarceration costs alone exceeded $30,000 annually per inmate. The resources devoted to enforcing GHB prohibition could have funded comprehensive treatment programs, but policy prioritized punishment over public health. Insurance companies began excluding coverage for GHB-related complications, classifying them as resulting from illegal drug use. This meant that overdose victims often faced massive medical bills on top of their health crises. The financial devastation pushed some users further into addiction, since legitimate employment became nearly impossible with destroyed credit and medical debt. Long-term recovery remained possible but difficult. Some former users achieved stable sobriety and rebuilt their lives over years of sustained effort. They described the experience as having survived something that killed many others through a combination of luck, support, and determination. Their recovery stories provided hope, but couldn't erase the years lost to addiction and the permanent changes GHB had carved into their brains and bodies. The 2020s brought a resurgence nobody predicted. Gen Z discovered GHB through TikTok harm reduction accounts and Reddit forums, learning about the substance from educational content intended to prevent overdoses rather than glamorize use. The algorithm's neutral presentation of drug information created unintended consequences. Warnings about GHB's dangers also advertised its existence to users who'd never heard of it. Social media transformed drug culture by democratizing information that previously required underground connections. A teenager in suburban Ohio could learn GHB's effects, synthesis methods, and dosing guidelines from their bedroom without ever meeting a dealer or visiting a club. The knowledge barrier that once limited drug experimentation had completely dissolved. Instagram accounts with names like safer.use and harmreduction.info provided detailed GHB guides, how to measure doses with syringes, why scales were useless for liquids, which substances never to combine, how to recognize overdose. The accounts accumulated tens of thousands of followers while operating in a legal grey zone. They weren't selling drugs, but were certainly facilitating use. Dating apps evolved new code words for GHB that varied by region and changed frequently to avoid detection. Looking for party favors meant something different than party and play, which differed from generous friends only. The euphemisms created plausible deniability, while clearly signaling drug availability to those who knew the current terminology. Snapchat became a preferred platform for GHB dealing because messages disappeared automatically, reducing evidence of transactions. Dealers posted their inventory through stories visible only to approved followers. Buyers messaged privately to arrange purchases. The entire transaction occurred through an app designed for casual photo sharing, making law enforcement interdiction nearly impossible without extensive surveillance. Cryptocurrency payments allowed dealers to operate without traditional financial paper trails. Bitcoin, Monero, and other cryptocurrencies facilitated anonymous transactions that banks couldn't trace. Buyers transferred digital currency. Dealers shipped packages labeled as cleaning supplies or cosmetics, and the entire exchange occurred without creating prosecutable evidence. The COVID-19 pandemic paradoxically increased GHB use in some populations while decreasing it in others. Club closures eliminated the recreational party scene where casual use occurred, but isolated individuals discovered GHB as a sleep aid and anxiety reducer during lockdowns. Online sales spiked as people unable to leave their homes sought chemical relief from pandemic stress. Telehealth's expansion during the pandemic created new opportunities and challenges. Narcolepsy patients finally accessed Xyrem prescriptions through video consultations rather than traveling to specialized sleep centers. But the relaxed medical oversight also made it easier for addiction to develop unnoticed when doctors weren't seeing patients in person. The fentanyl crisis created a new GHB danger that harm reduction organizations struggled to address. Dealers sometimes added opioids to GHB either deliberately or through contamination. The combination of a powerful depressant and an opioid could stop breathing instantly. Fentanyl test strips became standard equipment in harm reduction kits alongside GHB dosing syringes. Testing services emerged where users could mail samples for laboratory analysis before consumption. These services operated in legal grey zones. Technically, they didn't condone drug use, but practically they enabled safer use. Results showed disturbing variability. Bottles labelled as GHB sometimes contained GBL, 1,4-BD, or even entirely different substances. Consistency was fictional in underground markets. The fitness community rediscovered GHB in the late 2010s through biohacking forums and peptide communities. Young men seeking muscle growth and recovery found GHB through the same internet searches that revealed peptides, SARMs, and other grey market performance enhancers. This cycle that began in 1980s gyms repeated itself with new technology, enabling the same old patterns. Online forums like Reddit's Research Chemicals discussed GHB and its precursors with clinical detachment, sharing experiences and advice while maintaining plausible deniability about use. Moderators deleted explicit sourcing information, but allowed detailed discussion of effects, dosing, and harm reduction. The forums created vast repositories of user-generated knowledge about substances that medical research ignored. Darknet markets evolved sophisticated systems for GHB distribution. Vendors accumulated hundreds of reviews establishing reputations for quality and consistency. Escrow systems protected buyers from scams. The markets operated like Amazon for drugs, complete with customer service, refund policies, and vendor competition driving prices down and quality up. Law enforcement made occasional headline-grabbing busts of major GHB operations, but the decentralized nature of production meant that arrests rarely impacted availability. Shutting down one laboratory just shifted production elsewhere. Arresting high-volume dealers created opportunities for replacements. The whack-a-mole enforcement strategy consumed resources without reducing supply. European harm reduction approaches increasingly influenced American policy discussions. Portugal's drug decriminalization model, which reduced overdose deaths and addiction rates, prompted some American cities to reconsider purely punitive approaches. Pilot programs in Philadelphia, Seattle, and San Francisco established supervised consumption sites where medical personnel could intervene during overdoses. These harm reduction sites saved lives but faced intense political opposition. Critics argued they enabled drug use rather than preventing it. Supporters pointed to reduced overdose deaths and increased treatment referrals. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about whether drug policy should prioritize punishment or public health outcomes. Narcan vending machines appeared in cities with high overdose rates, providing free naloxone to reverse opioid overdoses. But naloxone doesn't work on GHB because the mechanisms are completely different. Some harm reduction advocates pushed for similar GHB emergency resources, but no reversal agent existed. The only treatment for GHB overdose remained supportive care until the drug cleared naturally. The chemsex culture that developed in the 2000s had evolved by the 2020s into something more visible and medicalized. Sexual health clinics in major cities offered judgment-free testing and treatment specifically for the chemsex community. These clinics understood the culture and didn't moralize about drug use, focusing instead on reducing harms like HIV transmission and overdose prevention. London's 56 Dean Street Clinic became internationally recognised for its chemsex specialisation. The clinic offered combination services, sexual health testing, addiction treatment, mental health counselling, and harm reduction advice. This integrated approach acknowledged that separating sexual health from drug use was impossible for chemsex participants, and that moralising only pushed people away from care. Apps like Grindr began allowing drug-related content after years of prohibiting it, recognizing that banning discussion didn't stop use but did prevent harm reduction messaging from reaching users. The policy shift was controversial but pragmatic. Better to allow party and play in profiles where public health campaigns could reach users than force everything into hidden channels. Universities updated their sexual assault protocols to include specific GHB testing procedures. Campus health centres maintained rapid GHB testing capabilities and trained staff to recognise symptoms. But the substance's rapid metabolism meant that students arriving 12 to 24 hours after assault still had no physical evidence, leaving prosecutors unable to pursue cases. Spring break destinations implemented new security measures, drink testing coasters that changed colour if drugs were present, increased security presence, public awareness campaigns. These measures created the appearance of action while having minimal impact. The testing coasters produced false positives from common drink ingredients and false negatives for actual GHB in carefully calibrated doses. Music festivals developed sophisticated medical operations specifically designed for drug-related emergencies. Staff carried extensive pharmacological knowledge about various substances and their interactions. The medical tents at major festivals resembled emergency departments in equipment and capability, acknowledging the reality that attendees would use drugs regardless of official policies. The normalization of drug use at festivals created a culture where collapsing from GHB was unremarkable rather than scandalous. Experienced festival goers knew to check on unconscious people, but otherwise didn't panic. This casualness prevented some death through quick intervention, but also normalized genuinely dangerous behavior by treating overdose as a routine inconvenience. Addiction medicine specialists began calling for GHB to be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to allow proper research into treatment protocols. The criminal classification prevented academic researchers from studying the substance systematically. What medical science knew about GHB addiction and withdrawal came mostly from emergency case reports rather than controlled studies. Some researchers pursued GHB studies anyway despite regulatory obstacles, navigating complex approval processes to conduct small trials. Their work revealed that the substance was more complex pharmacologically than anyone had realized. It had therapeutic potential for conditions beyond narcolepsy, while also carrying serious addiction liability. But funding was scarce for research on a stigmatized substance. By 2025, GHB existed in a strange equilibrium. Widely used in specific subcultures, heavily criminalized, occasionally medicalized, and constantly evolving. The substance that started as a French anesthesiologist's sleep aid had become a multifaceted phenomenon that revealed more about human culture than about chemistry itself. GHB's 6-decade journey from operating theatre to street corner revealed patterns that transcended one substance's history. Dr. Henri Laborie synthesized a molecule in 1960 intending to help surgical patients wake up without nausea. By 1985, bodybuilders were buying it legally in health food stores next to protein powder. By 1995, ravers were dosing each other in club bathrooms, while predators weaponized the same substance against assault victims. By 2002, the FDA approved it as Schedule III medicine, while keeping it Schedule and contraband simultaneously. The transformation illustrated a fundamental truth about drugs that policymakers consistently refuse to acknowledge. Molecules don't have inherent moral qualities. GHB isn't evil. It's not good either. The clear liquid sitting in a bottle possesses no ethical dimension until human intent applies it towards some purpose. The same dose that restores sleep to a narcolepsy patient renders an assault victim unconscious for hours. Chemistry doesn't change. Context determines everything. This lesson applied to virtually every controversial substance in pharmaceutical history. Morphine relieves unbearable pain and creates devastating addiction. Amphetamine treats ADHD and fuels destructive binges. Benzodiazepines calm anxiety and cause life-threatening withdrawal. The molecule itself isn't the problem. Uncontrolled access, misuse, and ignorance create harm while controlled medical application provides relief. GHB exemplified this duality more starkly than almost any other substance. The prohibition experiment failed by every measurable metric. Congress criminalized GHB in 2000, intending to reduce availability, prevent sexual assaults, and protect public health. 25 years later, the substance remained widely available through precursor chemicals and underground manufacturing. Sexual assault cases continued because determined criminals don't obey drug laws. Public health worsened because prohibition eliminated quality control while driving users toward riskier behaviors. Underground GHB in 2025 was more dangerous than legal GHB in 1989 despite identical chemistry. Legal supplement bottles at least attempted consistent concentrations. Underground batches varied wildly because manufacturers operated without oversight or accountability. Users in the 1980s could ask health food store employees about dosing. Users in the 2020s relied on Reddit posts and TikTok videos. Prohibition created precisely the chaos it claimed to prevent. The sexual assault angle particularly revealed Prohibition's failures. Making GHB illegal didn't stop predators from obtaining and using it. Criminals by definition don't follow laws, but criminalization did prevent open discussion about recognizing drugged drinks, responding to overdoses, and supporting assault survivors. The stigma and legal fears kept victims from reporting attacks and seeking help until evidence had disappeared. Harm reduction approaches worked where prohibition failed. European cities that embraced testing services, supervised consumption sites, and medical support for users saw reduced overdose deaths without increased use rates. American cities that maintained purely punitive approaches saw higher mortality and morbidity without reducing availability. The data was clear, but ideology trumped evidence in policy discussions. The pharmaceutical approval of Xyrem exposed Prohibition's internal contradictions. Jazz Pharmaceuticals could legally manufacture, distribute, and profit from GHB, while the DEA simultaneously imprisoned people for possessing chemically identical substances. The dual scheduling acknowledged that GHB had legitimate medical value while maintaining the fiction that recreational use deserved criminal punishment. The policy incoherence was obvious to anyone paying attention. Xyrem's success demonstrated that GHB could be used safely with proper medical oversight, consistent dosing, and patient education. Thousands of narcolepsy patients took pharmaceutical GHB nightly without problems. The difference wasn't the molecule, it was the context. Known concentration, measured doses, medical monitoring, and absence of alcohol or other drugs. The same principles that made Xyrem safe could theoretically make recreational GHB safer, if applied through regulation rather than prohibition. But American drug policy couldn't acknowledge this reality without admitting that prohibition was ideological rather than scientific. Regulators had committed to a framework where illegal drugs were inherently dangerous and legal medicines were inherently safe. GHB's dual status threatened that binary by proving it was false. The response was cognitive dissonance, simultaneously approving and criminalizing the same substance while pretending the contradiction didn't exist. The human cost accumulated regardless of policy debates. Assault survivors lived with trauma from attacks they couldn't remember. Addicts suffered through withdrawal that rivaled delirium tremens in severity. Overdose victims died or survived with permanent brain damage. Families watched loved ones deteriorate into addiction or mourned their deaths. The suffering was real while the policy remained detached from reality. GHB's story also revealed how drug cultures evolved and spread through technology. The substance moved from French laboratories to American gyms through medical journals and bodybuilding magazines. It reached club culture through word of mouth and dealer networks. It exploded globally through internet forums and dark web markets. Each technological advancement accelerated distribution, while making enforcement more difficult. Social media's role was particularly significant because it democratized drug knowledge in unprecedented ways. Previous generations learned about substances from friends, dealers, or underground publications with limited distribution. Modern users accessed comprehensive information instantly from anywhere. This wasn't inherently good or bad. It meant safer use for some and encouraged experimentation for others. The genie couldn't be returned to the bottle. The fitness community's repeated discovery of GHB across decades illustrated how drug trends cycled through different populations. Bodybuilders in the 1980s, ravers in the 1990s, chemsex culture in the 2000s, and biohackers in the 2020s all independently found the substance and adapted it to their specific needs. Each community believed they'd discovered something novel when they were actually repeating patterns from years earlier. This cycle suggested that drug use responded to deeper human drives that transcended specific substances or time periods. People sought performance enhancement, altered consciousness, social connection, or escape from psychological pain. GHB temporarily satisfied those needs for some users. Banning it didn't eliminate the underlying desires, it just shifted them toward other substances or riskier behaviors. The assault cases represented the darkest application of these drives. Predators sought power and control through incapacitating victims. GHB provided an effective tool, but removing GHB wouldn't eliminate sexual assault any more than removing alcohol, roofies, or any other disinhibiting substance. The problem was predatory behavior, not specific chemicals. Policy that focused on substances rather than conduct missed the actual issue. Looking at GHB's complete history revealed a pattern of unintended consequences at every stage. Laborit created a safer anesthetic that proved too unpredictable for surgery. Supplement companies marketed a legal product that caused overdoses and deaths. Congress banned GHB to prevent assault but pushed users toward more dangerous precursor chemicals. The FDA approved Xyrem while maintaining criminal penalties for identical substances. Each decision generated outcomes opposite to stated intentions. The fundamental lesson was that drug policy based on moral panic rather than evidence consistently failed. GHB became the date rape drug in public consciousness despite alcohol being used far more frequently to facilitate assault. The media coverage and legislative response fixated on a specific substance while ignoring the broader context of sexual violence. This pattern repeated with crack cocaine, methamphetamine, and numerous other substances where fear drove policy rather than data. Better approaches existed but required acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Prohibition didn't work for alcohol in the 1920s and didn't work for GHB in the 2000s. Regulation with appropriate controls reduced harm more effectively than criminalization. Medical supervision enabled safe use of dangerous substances. Harm reduction saved lives that abstinence-only approaches failed to reach. The evidence was clear, but implementing it required political courage that remained scarce. GHB would continue existing regardless of laws, attitudes, or policies. The chemistry was too simple, the effects too compelling to specific populations, the profits too attractive to underground manufacturers. The substance would keep cycling through new users and new subcultures, causing both benefit and harm depending on context. The only question was whether society would respond intelligently by minimizing harm or ideologically by maximizing punishment without reducing risk. The story that began with a French anesthesiologist trying to help surgical patients wake up comfortably had become a complex saga involving bodybuilders, ravers, predators, pharmaceutical companies, lawmakers, harm reduction activists, and millions of users seeking something: performance, euphoria, connection, or unconsciousness. The molecule remained unchanged. The humans surrounding it created everything else: the benefits, the harms, the policy failures, and the ongoing struggle to find approaches that reduce suffering rather than moralizing about consciousness alteration itself.